Okay, so it looks like we're live, and my name is Sandra, or I usually go by Sandy Sjollema, and I'm here today with Meriel Whale, and this is the webinar called "The Overlooked and the Unspoken: A Queer Experience of Childlessness," and this is the second day of World Childless Week 2025. And Muriel and I are basically just going to be having kind of a conversation between the two of us for the next 50 minutes or so. If there's any questions, as Stephanie mentioned, you could put them in the question box or whatever. And if we have time at the end, we might address a few of the questions, but we'll see how it goes if we have some time. So we just thought that we would start out by basically just introducing ourselves. How do we identify as queer? Because there's a lot of different ways to identify as queer. And also maybe a little bit of our coming out experience and anything else that we want to say to introduce ourselves. So I will let you start, Muriel.
Thanks very much, Sandy. So, yes, my name's Meriel. I live near Brighton in the UK. I'm a queer counsellor, queer celebrant, queer writer, and in some ways, I'm what's colloquially known as a later in life lesbian. Um, in that, during my journey to parenthood, which ended about 10 years ago, some of it happened when I was still in the closet. But in some ways, I'm not a later in life lesbian because I was a teenager when I started sensing that I wasn't entirely straight. And I started talking about it to some of my friends. And this carried on between the ages of 17 and 21. So it's gradually, when I felt comfortable, I was speaking to people, mostly other queer people, to be honest. And then when I was 21, I started to speak about it more widely to people. And then I had a really bad reaction from someone very close to me, very important to me. And at that point, so again, I was only 21. I went back into the closet, partially back into the closet, and because it was so shocking to me to have that reaction. And so I used to say to people, some people, again, if I felt comfortable with them, mostly other queer people, I used to say some people that I was bisexual. But I found it really hard to acknowledge the fact that I was actually a lesbian. And I think I began to carry some really significant internalized homophobia, which did impact on my journey to being a parent. I think it's really important to mention as well in the UK that we had something called Section 28, which meant, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, who was one of our prime ministers, that schools weren't allowed to promote homosexuality. So that was really hard for LGBTQIA plus teachers and educators. It was really hard for queer pupils. So there was really nothing at school, no support, no language, no affirmation. And it was a recipe in a way for internalized homophobia to really run rampant. Not for everybody, because we're all different. And I think one of the things we want to emphasize today is there are many, many roots in the queer identity, many journeys, and there's many roots and journeys towards being childlessness. There's no one story. So that's a little bit about my identity. And I did start coming out in 2013. I came out, it was a quicker process than it had been when I was in my very late teens and early 20s. And funnily enough, the people who'd been so challenging and who couldn't accept who I was were in a very different place by then, which was a relief, because I was still a bit scared. So that's kind of a very short journey to where I am now. And I'll talk in a bit about my journey through childlessness and how the two did intersect. But Sandy, is that enough for now? Would you like to introduce yourself? You're on mute at the moment. Oh, there you are, brilliant.
Okay,
And then I can
there
come
we
back to
go.
childlessness in a minute.
All right, sure. So once again, my name is Sandy Sjollema. I am 61 years old and I live in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I identify as queer, I guess, in two different ways. One is in terms of my gender identity, and I do go by she, they. From the time I was a small child, I felt different from other girls. I just wanted to wear my hair short. I wanted to wear jeans. I wanted to run around. I was not presenting femininity or performing femininity very well, according to the people around me, and specifically my mother, who was very horrified by all of this. Because for her, the fact that was a tomboy was a sure tale sign that I was going to turn into a lesbian. And my mother was probably one of the most homophobic people I've ever met in my life. So to deal with that, like in my face, 24 hours a day, where she would make a point of telling me how embarrassed she was by me. I was devastated. And I felt at the same on the one hand, I felt like I wanted to be myself and this is who I am. And then on the other hand, I felt like I had to conform. And yeah, there's a certain heteronormativity or whatever that, I started internalizing from a very young age. Throughout my life, I kept on feeling like I was different than sort of mainstream women, not only in my dress and my presentation, but just, things that seemed very important to other women were not that important to me, like finding a man and getting married and this kind of thing. However, similarly to what Meriel said, I grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, in the 1960s and 1970s. Absolutely no representation of any same-sex couples, marriage, whatever, nothing. It was like dead in the water. And the only thing I heard about gay people was negative, especially from the mouth of my own mother, who could be quite vicious in her comments. Another thing that impacted me was AIDS. I came into my 20s when the AIDS crisis was full throttle. I had friends who died of AIDS, and I know that it was mostly homosexual men that were, having issues with AIDS and were the main people getting AIDS. But I just saw this viciousness towards homosexual people, and I thought, well, if they feel that way about gay men, they probably feel that way about gay women too, for that matter. So I started, and this is the second way that I identify as queer, in my late teens and early 20s. It became pretty obvious that I could be sexually attracted to women, just to put it very bluntly. And my body was reacting in a certain way, and it's like, what's going on here? But I don't think it was and I still today, by the way, identify as basically pansexual, bisexual, pansexual, because I still have attractions to men, to cisgendered men. But I think I started feeling attractions toward women, and I think it was an unconscious decision that I made, like at an unconscious level. I just shoved it as far away from me as I possibly could and didn't want to have anything to do with it. And Meriel talks about being a late in life lesbian. I didn't even verbalize my attraction towards same sex until I was in my 40s. And that was only in Montreal amongst a, sort of small, select group of people. And I couldn't sort of not say anything anymore because I actively was pursuing a woman at that time in my life. So it's like, come on, Sandy, lay the cards on the table because it's going to be pretty damned obvious. So that was the first step. And I didn't come out to my family until 4 years ago, after my mother died, because my mother was so virulently homophobic. And I could see how awful she could be towards gay people. I just didn't even dare say anything. So it was after she died that I came out as, bisexual, pansexual towards my family. By the way, if people don't know what pansexual means, because I get that all the time, what in God's name is pansexual? It basically means that the gender of the person doesn't really matter to me. I can be equally attracted to a cisgendered man, a cisgendered woman, a non-binary person, a transgendered person. I've had attractions, romantic, sexual, whatever, to all of the above. So basically, that's what pansexual means. But anyway, I didn't start coming out towards my, family origin until 4 years ago. And one thing that got me to come out was that, I had contact with younger people who were afraid to come out to their families. And I thought, how can I tell them that it's okay to come out to their families if I'm not doing it? I need to set a good example. I have a certain responsibility to people who are younger than me, who are queer, to tell them, it's okay to be who you are publicly. So that's all I'll say about my journey in terms of coming, to terms with my identity as a queer person. I think the second thing we wanted to talk about was, as you were saying earlier, Meriel, was about how our queer identity interacted with our search for parenthood or motherhood, whichever way you want to put that. So maybe you can say a few words on that.
Absolutely. And I also want to pick up on, there was so much that you said, Sandy, that was really familiar. And I think one of the things that I noticed particularly, or two things actually, how difficult the generation above us can sometimes be. But and how much responsibility we can have to the generation below us, even if we're not their parents. I sometimes feel that we, as queer people, we still have a role to play in the lives of younger queer people. And the other thing that I really noticed from what you were saying was about it's easier to come out to small select groups of people. That was my experience, that was your experience as well, that if someone is giving off signals that they may also be queer, or at least queer affirmative, we pick up on those signals and we think maybe this is a safe person to talk to, because those safe people to talk to were not always available to us. So we had to really listen and be hypervigilant. And I think that hypervigilance can be there for us as childless people as well. Who is safe to speak to? Who can I talk to about this? Who's going to say something tactless? Who's going to say something supportive? So I'm just picking up on some of the things that we've had to be as both queer and childless people to navigate this world. And I think, talking about my own journey towards becoming a parent, I think for the first part of my journey, I was in a straight passing relationship, and that didn't last. It was actually, the experience of childlessness that ended that relationship. And it was at that point that I thought, you know what, I've thought I was queer my whole life, certainly since being a young teenager anyway, not entirely my whole life, but certainly since my teenage years. Maybe now's the time for me to start thinking and talking about that. But at the same time, I'm running parallel to this journey was my journey towards adoption, which ultimately was fruitless. And the two things happened very much alongside each other. So there was really complex situations, two really complex situations going on. I was coming into my identity as a lesbian, as a queer person, and I was still seeking to be a parent through adoption. So when I began the adoption process, again, I was ostensibly straight. And at that point, I hadn't really started to come out even to myself. So as I began going through the adoption process, I got to the point when I was thinking, it's probably time for me to tell the social workers about my identity. But before I could do that, I started going through coming to the realization that the social workers were probably going to turn me down for adoption, which is what happened. So before I could fully enter that identity as a potential parent, that route was completely closed to me. Now I did appeal. I appealed and appealed because I was not about to give up. And I went to the highest level of appeal in the UK, which was partially successful in that they recommended that I should be able to adopt. But that was only a recommendation, and none of the local authorities in my area would heed that recommendation. So my journey to being a parent ended 10 years ago this month, just as I started to really fully enter that queer identity. So I was grieving one thing while celebrating something else. It was a really confusing time. And I think I talked earlier about internalized homophobia. I did feel as then a single person in the adoption system, like I already had a lot of things stacked against me. I was really scared to add being queer to that, which is why it took me so long to decide to come out to the social workers. And obviously in the end, I never got the chance to. So I was, again, these two really clashing, conflicting journeys. It was very confusing, sad, exciting, strange time to be in. And I really want to acknowledge at this point that there are, as I said earlier, there are so many stories as to there's so many versions of queerness in the world. In fact, almost as many as there are queer people, probably. There are so many journeys to childlessness, and I'm just sharing my story as one person's story. But yeah, aware that there are many, many, many more, many ways of being part of the queer community and being part of the childless community, including people who face direct discrimination and prejudice when trying to become a parent because of their sexuality or their gender identity. And yeah, the title of this webinar today is The Overlooked and the Unspoken. My sexuality has definitely been overlooked by myself and by others, and has been unspoken unless it's in a safe space. And I've seen there's a comment in the chat about safe spaces, which I'm really pleased to see. So yeah, the overlooked and the unspoken, I think, is a big part of both of these journeys. And I think, as I've pointed out in my two conflicting journeys that I was on at the same time, we've got a double whammy really as queer and childless people of the overlooked and the unspoken happening twice in a way, because we're queer, because we're childless.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about how you were in the grieving process of not being able to become a parent, and yet coming into your queer identity more or less at the same time.
Yeah.
Because that's a very similar thing that happened to me, actually.
Yeah.
And although our stories are very different and we live in different countries and whatnot, there's definitely some overlap there. And I think I'm 61, I think you're 52 is so we're not that apart in age to sort of be almost of the same generation. So maybe that's why there's some of those parallels as well, because if we had somebody who was 25 or 30 on the panel, it might be a different conversation.
Absolutely.
But anyway, in my case, I said earlier that I shoved any kind of same-sex attraction or non-heterosexual attraction basically as far away from me as I could. Even though I was still feeling it, and was aware of it, in myself. And I ended up trying to have children with men. Now, the thing is, I wasn't even sure I wanted to have children. I was quite ambivalent. Number one, because I had a very tumultuous relationship with my own mother. As I've mentioned earlier, she was very homophobic and on my case all the time about not presenting myself feminine in a feminine way or whatever. And I wasn't sure that I would be able to heal enough to not that I would repeat the same patterns in terms of a child being gay or whatever, but just overall repeating some of those patterns. So I was quite ambivalent for that reason. And also, like I mentioned earlier, I never saw myself really in sort of mainstream womanhood. And part of me was thinking, well, that's for quote unquote real women to go and have children. It's not for somebody like me, because I feel so different in some ways anyway, not in all ways, but in some ways from sort of mainstream womanhood. However, at one point I decided I was getting a little bit more up in age and decided, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. I might feel ambivalent, but at some point or another, if I don't do it now, it's going to be too late. So I tried to have children with men. And I think in retrospect, there was probably two reasons for that. One, it was going to be more socially acceptable. And no explanations or whatever, it's just the standard way to do things, right? So, and as Meriel was saying earlier, we all have different paths, and perhaps somebody, even of my generation and in my circumstances, would have been saying, well, I'm going to go and do it with a woman anyway, even if it's not socially acceptable, so we all have different paths when it comes to that kind of thing. And so I decided to do this with men for, number one, social acceptability. But number two, I thought that it would be easier in terms of it being done the natural way, because I didn't want to go through reproductive technologies. I ended up having to do that anyway, with the second person that I tried to have a child with because of my infertility. It wasn't a lot of, it was only like taking hormone treatment and also artificial insemination. I didn't have the funds for IVF, which were not covered at that time in the province of Quebec where I live. I think some of the treatments are covered now by the government, but they weren't at that time. So that wasn't a possibility for me. But anyway, just the idea that these were the two reasons that I chose to pursue the goal of being a parent or a mother with men. But the first one was with my ex-spouse, and it didn't work. I mean, it just didn't work. Even if it was done the natural way, it wasn't happening. And our marriage fell apart, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but I still had a little bit of time on my hands, so to speak. So I tried with the second individual. And this person was somebody I knew from the neighborhood, and I wasn't in love with him. I didn't want a standard heterosexual relationship with this person. I just wanted to be a co-parent, basically. And I didn't have the confidence to go it alone like Meriel. I really cheer you on for trying to adopt as a single person. That's very courageous. But for myself, I just didn't have the confidence to do it on my own. So I figured, I would need a co-parent, one for just to get the job done, to, get pregnant, and then also to raise a child. But I wasn't in love with this person, and this was the exact time that I fell in love and started pursuing the woman that I mentioned earlier. So here I am trying to conceive with the man while I'm pursuing a woman on the side. I mean, it all got very complicated. And he absolutely was insisting on us having a mainstream heterosexual relationship. And I said, I'm not interested in that. And anyway, it was not a good scene. My body was not responding anyway. I had problems with my uterus. I had fibroid tumors in my uterus. So there was all of this chaos happening in my relationship or personal life. Plus, my body was just saying, no way, Jose. So at one point, here I am, like 41 years old, 42 years old, and I said, I can't handle this anymore. This is too much for me to keep on going on in this situation. And at the end of the day, I think I made a good decision because this particular individual became very, like he was stalking me and all this after I, put the brakes on. And I thought, well, good thing I didn't have a child with this person. That's what I thought afterwards. But it was interesting because in the sense, same what Meriel was just saying was, here I was sort of trying and not succeeding in terms of getting pregnant, but actively pursuing a woman and sort of asserting that queer identity at the same time. So it's kind of strange that we both had that parallel experience. And then, yeah, I put the brakes on and, that was it in terms of pursuing being a parent for me. And I'm 61, so that was almost 20 years ago, like 19, 20 years ago. So it's been a fair bit of time. So basically, that's my story in terms of pursuing parenthood and shoving my queer identity to the side. And yeah.
And I think, yeah, I think that's what we used to have to do, some of us. And, you know, in some ways, again, there are lots of parallels between our stories. I mean, you know, I did try the natural way. Like you, there was too much wrong in my system to allow that to happen. And I was even advised by a consultant that IVF wouldn't really work, given everything that was going on inside internally, in a gynecological sense. So adoption was what was left. But I'd always been really, really positive about adoption anyway. And even back when I thought I could have children biologically, I still was really, really positive and keen on adoption. In some ways it was my first choice in a lot of ways, you know. So that made it even more heartbreaking in a way that it was denied me, for reasons that still seem really unfair. And as I say, at least the final panel did give me the go-ahead, even though that didn't lead to anything actually practical happening. And I guess the other thing you picked up on is that, you know, Sandy, is you and I are similar ages, we're of similar generations, and that makes me think of two things. One is, where are we now in relation to not having children, as older people? And the other thing it brings to mind is the generation coming up after us, which we can come on to in a minute, because I think things are different for that generation and for you know, many other generations as well coming up after us in a way. But yeah, if it's okay to ask, what's your relationship now as we're both older people to not having children? How does it feel for you now?
Well, I think the initial grief is over for me. I mean, like I said, it was close to 19, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And the first couple of years were the thick of it in terms of grieving that identity and that possibility. Now I've come to terms with it, you know, and I've adapted my life and pursued other means of purpose and meaning and you know, having what I consider to be a good life. You know, which took a hell of a lot of work
Yeah.
actually, because it certainly wasn't given to me, I can tell you that much. Because if you don't follow the regular path and that says this is how you pursue a good life and this is how you pursue a meaning in your life and this is the way to go, and you're just flung out into the sort of the forest by yourself, or
Yeah.
maybe not completely alone, but and you have to pad your own, you have to carve your own path like that. That it's not easy at all. So it
No.
takes a lot of effort, and that's certainly been my situation. In terms of being childless, I get a lot of comments now as to whether or not I have grandchildren. I mean, I've got gray hair and, you know, I'm obviously older. So it's the children comments per se have kind of died down at this point, but mostly now it's the grandchildren. Oh, you must have grandchildren. How many grandchildren do you have? And this kind of thing. I think where my childlessness really hurts me still is that I often feel left out. And this can even be in family situations where I'm going to a family gathering, and everybody's talking about their children and everybody's talking about child rearing, or, you know, the next one is having another grandchild. I should mention too that my brother at one point converted to a specific religion where, in the traditional form of that religion anyway, they're supposed to have a lot of children. So him and his wife ended up having 7 children. And each of those kids, well, not all of them, but at least some of them are following suit. So now my brother and his wife have like maybe 14 grandchildren. I've lost count,
Wow.
frankly, with more on the way kind of idea. So when
Yeah.
I go to a family reunion, you can imagine the whole, you know, conversation and whatever is all talking about kids. And I can't participate, you know, I'm just sitting there as an audience member, basically. Um, And I do find that in general, and this is not everybody, but in general, I find that people who are parents or grandparents, they're not particularly interested in my life. They expect me to be their captive audience, but they will never say, oh, well, Sandy, what are you up to? What kind of things are you pursuing that you're interested in, or whatever? I went back to university and I have a PhD, and I did a lot of interesting things in the meantime. But and that's the thing that really hurts me, is that my life doesn't seem to count.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's a little aside. You know, and this too, it may, even in my family, that's very hurtful, and
Yeah.
if it's people I don't know very well, or I just meet superficially, that so much I don't really care about. And that's what hurts me the most at this point, the queer part of my identity. I mean, people are not going to, that I'm meeting superficially at the store or whatever, not going to say, oh, by the way, are you heterosexual? It's like that doesn't come into casual conversation most of the time, but the children or grandchildren part certainly does.
Yeah.
So I find that really, of my identity presently, I find that the hardest to deal with, that part of it, for feeling left out a lot of the time, and that my life has no significance to other people.
Yeah.
So how about you? What's your experience been
Yeah, it's
like?
really interesting because I think we have, as childless people, we still have life cycles. We don't go through life unmarked just because we don't have a child's life cycle alongside ours to measure ourselves by. So yeah, I think we still have milestones and we still have life cycles, but I think unfortunately the dominant discourse in society is that people have children, and that gives us a meaning and that gives us a purpose, and that makes our lives, I think we can all probably reflect on the amount of times that someone said on the news about a particularly tragic situation, well, as a mother, I feel really like this. Whereas I always want to kind of shout at the screen, as a human, I also feel like this. I'm not cut off from the tragedy of the situation because I've never given birth to an infant. I am a human, and I feel like, I still feel this. So we're kind of watching this discourse go along. And recently, the generation I'm in, my friends' kids have started going to university. And there's been post after post after post on social media, which can be quite a painful place to be. Again, in September, you get the children going back to school photos, particularly if it's their first day at primary school or their first day at secondary school. That's in the UK. I know schools are called different things in different countries, but primary school is kind of 5, secondary school is kind of 11. And then you get university. So at the moment, I've got an absolute deluge of posts of people dropping their kids off at university. And I found that surprisingly painful, actually.
Right.
I'm definitely finding that I thought that a lot of my grief had changed and that there was more space around my grief. But actually, I'm as affected by these life cycles as other people are. It's just it's difficult for me to see people saying, yeah, I'm dropping my kids off at university and this is what it feels like. There's been so many photos of smiling children in university rooms. I'm a bit like, wow. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that while I do have more space around my grief, and I haven't quite got to the stage where my friends are having grandchildren yet, although I'm not looking forward to it very much. I have now got this university thing happening, which is definitely quite hard. So yeah, it changes. I guess my grief changes, but it doesn't go away. There's more room around it,
Right.
but I can still be surprisingly triggered by things which I wasn't expecting. And I wrote a blog a few years ago for counsellors with children who are working with clients without children. I wrote in that blog that your childless client has been changed as profoundly and permanently as you have by not being a parent as you have by being a parent. And I do think that that's true. We are not the same people that we were before we tried to be parents. And
Absolutely.
that goes to everybody, whether we've tried IVF, whether we tried adoption, whether we didn't even have the chance to try because we didn't meet somebody with whom we could have children in our fertile period,
Right.
or because we had trauma from our childhoods that meant that being a parent just didn't feel doable for us. We're still different people. We're not the same people. We're not living the life that we lived in our 20s of going out.
No,
You know, we're
that's
still.
right.
So yeah, and I can see people commenting in the chat, and I'm really grateful for these comments about what it's like to go through the life cycle with this. So yes, I think the compassion, having compassion for ourselves and having compassion for other childless people is really crucial. And I think as queer people, we're almost one step removed, because people might assume that we don't have kids because we're from the LGBT plus community, because
Right.
it
Yeah.
wasn't possible in the 50s, 60s.
Right. It's very recent.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's a little part of me, and it's quite hard to acknowledge this, but it's there. I feel jealous of the younger queer generations for whom it's
Yeah,
easier.
me too.
I'm really glad it's easier for them. I really want them to
Yes.
have a better experience than the one I had. But I feel a little bit jealous as well because it's easier for
Hmm.
them. And it's not very, I don't
Right.
feel very happy about acknowledging this, but it's there. I
Right.
want it to be better for the younger generation.
Hmm.
I'm glad that
Yeah,
it
me
is.
too.
But yeah,
I was going to say something about, the life cycle changes and
yeah,
whatnot. And my sort of feeling about this is that some people tend to view queer people as not really adults either.
yes.
Queer people are sort of the bar hoppers and, going to the gay bars in the gay district or whatever and partying it up and are sort of these eternal teenagers. And I find that sometimes as a childless person, that gets put on to me as well. Well, you don't have any responsibilities, so, you're just like this overgrown teenager. And I feel that, at least in my generation, I don't know if the younger generation of queer people are getting this, but certainly of my generation, there was that idea that, queer people were just footloose and fancy free or whatever. And we're really into the bar scene and all of this kind of thing. And I can tell you that, you know, I'm a caregiver at this point in my life, and that's a hell of a responsibility. I can tell you that much. And, how come that's not acknowledged as being something that, a lot of queer and childless people take on in their families of origin? Whether it be towards their parents or towards their partners. But that seems to be something also that's overlooked. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think throughout history, again, certainly in the UK, and I don't know so much about other countries, but throughout history, the spinster woman, not man, but the spinster woman has been the woman who stays at home and looks after her parents. Um, and almost every family wanted to have an unmarried woman in their family so that she could take on
Right.
that role, and that
That's
still
right.
happened. That still happens, that if you're childless and in a relationship, or childless and single, you're often expected to be a caregiver. So our responsibilities are great. And yeah, we're not going out clubbing and partying, partly because I think childlessness makes us tired. It's a
Mm,
hard journey. It's really,
yes.
it's not an easy journey. And I think, yeah, there's certainly a view that, I mean, in the past, I've had kind of friends have said to me, "Oh, how are you doing?" I was like, "Gosh, I'm really, really tired." And they'll say something like, "Well, you think you're tired. I was doing up at, I had to get up at 6 in the morning to get my kid ready for school." And I was like, I get up at that time to go to work. I don't stay in
Right.
bed. So these tiredness competitions that happen
Right.
really are really frustrating. So yeah, um,
Mhm.
it's the eternal teenager, whether you're queer or childless, is
Yeah, I'd see an intersection there
yeah,
between those two. That's been my experience anyway.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, there's one thing I do want to bring up again, it's particularly in the UK, but it's happening a lot in the States at the moment as well, is an increasing prejudice towards all queer people, but specifically towards trans and non-binary and genderqueer people.
Right. Right.
And one of the things I wanted to do as part of this webinar is just to read a little bit of a trans person's experience of childlessness.
Sure. I've actually read it before, but
Yeah.
I'd like to hear it again.
Yeah,
Sure.
because it's a scary and dangerous time at the moment for trans people, and I feel like we need to stand up and support them particularly. But so yeah, this is somebody who wrote this blog from my website under an assumed name after hearing me do a shout out for trans people's experience of childlessness on the Full Stop podcast. And this person said that, like many, I'd always known I wanted a child, and I didn't foresee becoming childless, not by choice. I'd already faced enough personal challenges for a lifetime, I thought, coming out as gay at 19 and then transgender at 29. Gay families weren't seen when I was growing up, let alone queer families. But as time went by, they started to become more visible and even welcomed. Just think, all those years, I thought I'd be childless because of a social objection and lack of access were over, and I could see through my dream of becoming a parent. Other queer people were doing it, including other trans men, some even through becoming pregnant themselves. Never in a million years did I want to become pregnant, so adoption was the first step. Anyway, it became clear that adoption would not be an option. With gender roles aside and caring less about others' opinions as I entered my mid-30s, I surprised myself by thinking, heck with it, I'll use my own body if I can find a sperm donor. Long story short, 3 years later, I came to what's been dubbed the full stop. I couldn't continue on between the drawn-out wait times due to the pandemic, the exorbitant cost, key treatment prices ballooned by almost 500%, and my workplace didn't offer fertility-related health insurance. And the final straw, the painful procedures and aftermath, coinciding with a separate health issue. The mental health challenge of dysphoria during this time was also a factor, though I felt I could tough it out. It was for a child after all. The overall experience has been quite isolating. It was rare in the LGBTQ plus community to find another trans man going through this process, and I was often told by doctors or medical staff that I was unique to their care. If there was a silver lining to it all, it's the vast change in positive attitude and acceptance I received versus when I first started my transition. So, and then he carries on to say, the finality of stopping left me feeling doubly stung. The first sting from getting my hopes up that I could have a child despite being trans, and the second sting from becoming childless altogether. My mental health plummeted as a result. While I believe I'll always carry this grief in my heart, like any other, I'm learning to grow with it. I now see a future where I can add value, where I'm just as worthy as anyone else, and I'm pursuing goals that will create meaning in my life. So just want to give that voice a shout out. And I'd also really like to say that there's been some great blogs today on the World Childless Week page, but I'm really inviting more people to share their stories of being childless and queer in whatever way, whichever route you've taken, because I'd like to have more stories like that on my website, and so that we can start to build a picture of the complex and multifaceted ways that you can be queer, that you can be childless, and you can be queer and childless. So do feel free to share stories with me. Anyone who's watching this, if you shared it today already as part of World Childless Week, that's brilliant. And if you've got a story that you haven't shared and you'd like to, then feel free to contact me. But yeah, it seems really important to acknowledge that we are two voices. Our stories are unique to ourselves and they're absolutely valid, but there are many, many voices out there. It would be great to make this, give this group, this double whammy group of being childless and queer, a real voice. And
right. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I recently became the host of a LGBTQ subgroup on a childless collective, a community, online community. I think you were involved in that earlier at some point.
Yeah.
And we had this little debate about why isn't there more representation, as you're mentioning, and people came up with some ideas about that. And some people, one person mentioned allyship, that's how important it is for us to have allies, whether it be in the queer community or the childless community. And I totally agree with that. And I think that giving us this space, as Stephanie has done this year, well, Childless Week is certainly a good step in that direction, to give us that space. But at the end of the day, we're the only ones who can tell our stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And I know it's hard, and I know,
Absolutely.
I'm kind of shy to say, or a little maybe embarrassed to say, that it was only when my mother died that I could truly come out.
Yeah.
So if this was being done for maybe 6 years ago, I might not have wanted to do it in a public way, and I understand that there's still people who belong to religious, cultural, whatever minorities, where being gay is not the same thing as being a white, sort of a Western person or whatever. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it. But people's coming from specific communities or religions or whatnot still might have huge barriers to, talking about their experiences. Or even, as you mentioned, trans people, that's also another kind of subgroup that might still have more, discrimination and barriers, So I think it's a very, it's a very, very delicate thing.
Yeah. And I think this is the first time that we've had LGBTQ days as part of World Childless Week before, but I think this is the first time as part of World Childless Week that two queer people have dialogued together in a webinar.
Yes.
I think this is
that's what Stephanie told me.
Yeah.
So yay.
Yes. And it'd be really great next year to have more of us here talking.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I did, by the way, try to search out people in the childless community if anybody wanted to participate, but they're very enthusiastic about the fact that there was more representation in terms of the written submissions this year,
which has
and also about this webinar. But it's interesting too. I think one thing that I'm thinking about is, how am I received in the queer community as a childless person, and how am I received in the childless community as a queer person? And it's interesting because of my generation, there's still quite a number of people who don't have children in the queer community. So whenever I go into queer spaces, and, I even actually worked for a queer organization in Canada over the last number of years. It was a health research organization. So I've had, quite a bit of interactions with a variety of people in the community, and there seems to be kind of like a generational split, my generation, not so much, and the younger generation more so in terms of having children. But there doesn't seem to be, at least this has been my experience, the same automatic assumption that you must have children.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a bit more of a split. And if you do, you do, you don't, you don't. And I actually find queer spaces a bit of a breath of fresh air for that reason.
Yeah. I do agree that I think for queer people of our generation, it can be a safer space, because it was harder for queer people to become parents, and therefore we don't get so triggered. But on the other hand, then I feel sad about that, because we didn't get those opportunities. And I think one of the things I've tried to do a lot in the last few years is talk about being childless wherever I go. And what's happened, because I do that, and someone's just commented on this in the chat, actually, someone said about the healing power of hearing other people's stories when you feel alone. And one of the things that's happened is by talking about it a lot, then people come and start to tell me about their stories. And or like I'll talk about it in a social, in a group of counsellors, say a meeting of counsellors, and then I'll get an email a couple of weeks later from a counsellor saying, "Oh, could we have a coffee? I'd really like to talk about it." Or I'll talk about it at a book group, and the same thing will happen. So the more I talk about it, the more people come and talk to me, which I think is brilliant, because then the less alone I feel. And that's happened in the queer community as well. I talk about it in the queer community. and again, people will sidle up to me later and say, "Oh, I heard you say you were childless." I've never really talked about it. I really love to talk about it. So my openness about it, which can sometimes be painful because I feel I'm opening myself up for people to do bingo, you know, what JD Day calls bingos, to say, well, have you thought about? Yes, I've
Oh,
thought
right.
about
Yeah.
everything. And
Right.
you know
Right.
that queer people can adopt. Yes, I do know that. I do know that that can, you know, and I know all these things. So yeah, you're opening yourself up, but I think it's really important to do that, because there's people have come and spoken to me again from all different walks of life, but particularly in the queer community, who've never spoken about it. You know,
Right.
never spoken about it, and I think that's because we reflected on this earlier, because of assumptions about queer people not having children, not wanting children,
Right.
and because of that internalized homophobia, which
Hmm.
makes a lot of people think society thinks that queer people can't be parents. Well, maybe I think that a bit too. And I think that's one of the things we really need to challenge in ourselves.
Hmm.
That just because we're from the LGBTQ plus community doesn't mean we wouldn't have been as good a parent as anybody, and not
Oh,
to
for
try and
sure.
deal with that internalized homophobia as much as we can.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Just to follow up on what I was saying before, my experience in the childless community, being queer,
Mm.
is that yeah, there's definitely an openness to it. There's definitely it's a space for it to some
Yeah,
extent. Um, but at the same time, if there's sort of a more mainstream discussion happening, we might get slotted into the diversity
yeah,
crowd,
yeah,
as you were mentioning earlier. And the only way that we're going to take up more space is if we take it, you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
And like Jody Day with her watershed book that she wrote X number of years ago about being childless. I mean, she wasn't waiting around for people to say, oh, well, now it's your turn. You can go
mm,
now and talk about your
mm,
experiences.
yeah,
She took it. She took the bull by the horn, so to speak, and went for it. So yeah, that's just my thoughts about it, that
yeah,
there is that space given to us, but
yeah,
it's up to us to kind of run with it.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree. You know, and I guess that group on the platform that you were mentioning, I did run that group for a while. Um,
Yes.
you know, I think there's been a few other people in between you and I found it a very quiet group. People in it didn't talk very much, but it still felt really important that we were there. So if people wanted
Yes.
to, we were there for those conversations. Um,
Yes.
because we 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 can be invisible as childless people, we can be invisible as queer people. We don't need to be invisible as both, you know.
Right.
And the best place to get support is from, I think, is from people who are like us. And we touched on that very early on in our conversation, how when we began to come out as queer people, we did it in groups that felt safe. And I think
Right.
creating safe spaces like today, hopefully like this discussion, hopefully feels like a safe place where people are being so open in the chat, and I'm really grateful for it. Um, More and more we need to create these safe spaces and have our stories out there, so that we're not part of the conspiracy of silence that
Hmm.
queer people have been in for many, many years.
Right.
I wonder whether we could quickly go to the Q&A and just have a look at the questions.
Sure. We got a few minutes left.
Yeah, let's just see if we
By the
can.
way, I just want to say I'm really moved by the comment, you would have made amazing parents. That's very
Yeah,
moving. Thank you.
thank you. Um, So yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat which I think are related. So how can we educate people about the pain they cause when they ask if you have children or grandchildren? How can we get it to be as socially unacceptable as a racist or ableist question? And then there's a continuation, I think, of the same question. And how can we educate people about how hurtful the tiredness competition is?
Mm.
Yeah, I think these are really good questions. And I think that there's a lot, I mean, and I definitely want to hear Sandy's perspective and the perspective of anybody in the chat as well, actually. I think there's kind of two ways that we can do this. Well, there's going to be more than two, but at least two, let's say. One is to be more open about our stories if we feel safe and comfortable to do so. I do. I still find it uncomfortable, but I do put my story out there. So I think that's one way we can do it, is to really encourage empathy that way. And that's in a global setting. But in the nitty-gritty of those conversations, when someone assumes that we have children, who might says, "How old are your kids?" for example, instead of "Do you have children?" So assuming that we have them and asking how old they are, assuming we're part of that club when we're not, it's actually, I think, okay to say in that moment, if we feel safe and comfortable enough to do so, that's a really painful question. I've had people ask me, why did you get turned down for adoption? I don't talk about that. I don't talk about it, and apart from with people who are very close to me. So I just say that's a really painful question and I can't answer it. Or that's private and I don't talk about it. So
Right.
it's hard to be blunt because people might think we're being rude.
Right.
But sometimes I think a little bit of bluntness and a little bit of saying to people exactly how that question has landed with us is the right thing to do. Now, I normally think of that later. I don't think of it at the time.
Yeah, me too. I'm a late reactor.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think in my case, a lot of the time I will just be blunt and just say, that's a really private question. And I only discuss those kind of things with people that I'm very close to and just leave it at that. I don't personally have trouble with people making assumptions, like, especially if it's just in passing. It's like, okay, whatever. It's not like I'm close to these people, and I'm not going to sit there and start educating people when I'm just, talking to them for 2 minutes in the grocery line or whatever. That's my personal take on it. And, other people might react differently to that, and that's totally fine. But if they start asking more specific questions and start really getting what I think is crossing over a certain boundary that I don't feel comfortable with, I will just tell them straight out, I'm not answering that question. It's a private matter and I only discuss it with people that I'm close to. In other words, I'm not close to you, so you're not getting this information from me.
Yeah.
And I've had a few people react like, oh my God, like, why is this person being so abrupt? And it's just, well, too bad.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we can sometimes do, if it's hard for us to be that blunt, if it's hard for us to be that honest, and it's not easy for everybody, is to share someone else's story. So if somebody, I blog about my journey and it's on my website. So sometimes it's easier to share somebody else's story with a closer person who insists on asking you painful questions, to really share, well, I'm going to share a blog with you. I'd really like you to read it and then we can talk about it, because being one step removed can help.
Right.
But I think ultimately being willing to share how that question has made us feel. And there's in Jodie's book, there's quite a lot of stuff in there about different ways you can answer the question, do you have children? And I think it's really important to remember that no is a complete sentence.
Right.
So do you have children? No. Do you have grandchildren? No. But in terms of the educating people about the pain they cause, I think that is a lot harder. And I think that's where sometimes borrowing someone else's story can be a useful way to do it, if you don't feel comfortable enough to share your own. Yeah, there's some really great stuff going on in the chat, and people saying, can we collect these questions and answers somewhere? It's really helpful. And I would really invite people to email me if you want to share. I'm just putting my email address in the chat. If you want to share anything you've put in the chat today that might be helpful for other people, and then I can always share it.
So, Meriel, it seems like the hour is wrapping up.
That went really quickly.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, really great to have had this conversation. Really grateful to everybody who's been putting things in the chat. That's been fantastic. It's great to see those questions and comments coming along. And yeah, it's been lovely to be the first webinar with two queer people talking as part of World Childless Week.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just really want to thank everybody who showed up here today and for all of your comments and questions. And of course, to Meriel for accepting to take part.
Yes.
And also, of course, to Stephanie, who's the sort of mastermind behind the whole
thank you, Steph.
operation. Thank you so much for giving us this time and space to talk about these very important issues.
Really important. And like I say, if you have a story that you want to share, that you'd be happy to share anonymously or not, in the same way as the trans story on my website, do get in touch about anything really. But yeah. But I think that's the end of our webinar. So we're going to say goodbye and thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.